Welcome to mySci's Unit 25, Science in St. Louis. In these tutorial videos, we're going to go through each lesson and explain the key concepts and the activities you will be doing with your students as you go through this review unit. Lesson 1, students will answer the question, how did engineers consider both aesthetics and the St. Louis location in the design of the Gateway Arch? Students will look at natural hazards that we're prone to in the St. Louis area and weather and climate data. Students will take the conversation about natural hazards and weather and climate to discuss why engineers made certain structural choices when designing the St. Louis Arch. To begin this unit, you will introduce students to our design challenge. This design challenge is how might we improve or create a new exhibit to help people figure out the science behind St. Louis attractions. What that means is students are going to be designing their own exhibit for the St. Louis Science Center that is centered on one of our attractions in the St. Louis region. In the Engage portion of this lesson, you'll show students these two images. One image is of the arch from the Illinois side of the river, and the other image is a picture taken at the top of the arch. And you're going to use this as a discussion point to get students thinking about the Gateway Arch. In the Explore part of this lesson, students are going to find patterns of weather and natural hazards that occur in St. Louis. To do this, students will be put in groups and be given a set of the weather and natural hazard data cards. We'll have the groups go through these cards, look at the data on the front of the cards, and then discuss the questions that are located on the back of the cards. Once they have gone through the cards, they should record any general patterns that they noticed on their student page labeled St. Louis Weather and Natural Hazards. For part 2 of the Explore, students are going to look at how natural hazards and weather impacted the structural choices made by the engineers designing the St. Louis Arch. To start the discussion of the design choices made by the engineers of the arch, you'll first build this model of the St. Louis Arch. And then you're going to pose this question or this scenario to students saying, you're at the top of the arch and this awful storm rolls in, but you're completely safe. Why do you think that is? You'll then give each group a set of these arch design cards. Students will look at the features described on these cards and try to connect them back to the weather and natural hazard cards that they had looked at earlier in the Explore. For example, students will see that this card explains that the St. Louis Arch was made out of stainless steel, which does not rust when exposed to water. When they head back to their St. Louis Weather and Natural Hazards handout, they might put that the St. Louis Arch was made out of stainless steel because St. Louis experiences a decent amount of precipitation each year. Since the arch will be getting wet because of our precipitation in St. Louis, the stainless steel protects the arch from rusting. In the Explain portion of this lesson, students will obtain information about the design of the St. Louis Arch. They'll start off by reading the Gateway Arch. This is a read aloud book, and you can use the read aloud guide found in the teacher pages. The read aloud guide will allow you to point out the different features of the arch that allow the arch to withstand natural hazards and weather conditions in our area. Students will then watch a series of interviews with Gateway Arch historian Bob Moore about the different features of the St. Louis Arch specific to our unit. In the Elaborate portion of this lesson, students will consider cities that have different weather and climate patterns than St. Louis. They'll look at patterns in Australia, Senegal, and Alaska and discuss the barriers and constraints that engineers would have trying to build structures in those regions and how those constraints are different than those in St. Louis. During the Evaluate portion of this lesson, students will answer the question, how can we improve a hospital design to reduce the impact of a tornado? In the Evaluate, students will read a scenario about the 2011 Joplin, Missouri tornado and the hospital that was in the direct path of the tornado. Students will also have data about different types of tornado and the amount of damage those tornadoes can do. Students will then read a paragraph about the structural changes engineers made to the hospital in Joplin, Missouri when they were rebuilding it. Changes like making sure they had bulletproof glass, backup generators in case the power went out. Students will then be asked to evaluate 2 different hospital designs. The 2 designs are meant for a hospital in St. Louis, so students would need to consider the natural hazards that we have here in St. Louis when evaluating these designs. They'll then choose the best design and explain why they think that design is the best design solution. Students would then propose changes to be made to the weaker hospital design to make it a better solution. By the end of this lesson, students will have analyzed data about weather and climate patterns in St. Louis and different regions of the world, and they will have also evaluated 2 different design solutions to discuss how those design solutions reduce the impact of natural hazards.